This is a story about trees and about us as people. It starts, and it's a true story, by the way. It starts when I was a child, and my family would go and visit one set of my grandparents. They lived, maybe 20, 25 miles away from us, but in those days there were no freeways, and so it took a good drive to get there. And they lived in a city. The area in that city where they lived had very mature trees, even as a child. And the streets all around where my grandparents lived were lined with a particular kind of tree. And those trees had the most beautiful shape. The branches arched upward, and the street was just wide enough for two cars and a little bit more space, so that they could get by each other. So if someone was parked on one side of the street, you couldn't park exactly opposite for them because there would be no way to get through. So um, it was like 2.5 lanes wide, maybe at most. But the branches of these trees uh, were such that they touched over the middle of the street, and it formed this beautiful archway, kind of like a Gothic arch in a cathedral. And so driving down the street to Grandma and Grandpa's house, it was always like driving through this great big green tunnel of trees with the leaves on it. And in wintertime, because this was in a northern part of the United States and the trees lost their leaves, the branches still formed this beautiful archway. And in those couple of rare occasions when it snowed, it just the right kind of snow where it stuck to the tree branches until there was too much wind and then it got knocked off. But where it stuck to the tree branches, it looked like God had taken a great big tube of icing and just iced and decorated each one of those branches, the big ones and every single little one too. And it was absolutely gorgeous, like a Norman Rockwell painting. And I loved when we turned down the street to Grandma and Grandpa's, because we turned off of a more main road, and it did not have those trees lining the street. It was more of a business road. And all of the residential streets in that area had these trees. And so coming up towards Grandma and Grandpa's street, could look down every one of the streets and see this beautiful tunnel of greenery in summertime and the beautiful archways of the trees. And that was one of the most delicious parts of going to see my grandparents, at least until we got there, and then it was delicious being with my grandparents. And then I grew up and went away to college and would still come frequently to see Grandma and Grandpa. But then I went on to my graduate studies, which was at a seminary in another state. And so I didn't get to see Grandma and Grandpa nearly as often. And I remember one time driving with my parents to see my grandparents, and it was summertime. And I looked down one of those first side streets before we got to my grandparents' street, and I noticed that there were some of the trees missing. They were gone. And I commented on that to my parents in the car, and they said that there was a disease that was starting to infect that kind of tree. And the city was doing everything they could think of. They cut down some of the worst of them to try and stop the spread of the disease. They were using fertilizers, pumping that into the ground. They were using certain kinds of herbicides to try and kill off some of it, and pesticides, because the disease was carried by a beetle. And so they were trying everything to stop the spread of this disease. And I was thinking, wow, I sure hope they get that under control and stopped before it gets to my grandparents' street, which was like 5 or 6 blocks, not real far away from where I saw the trees missing. Well, as life would have it, it was quite a while, perhaps as much as a year, before I got to see my grandparents again. And again, it was a time where the leaves were on the trees. And I had long since forgotten about this disease stuff. And we came towards my grandparents, and I happened to look down that first street, and then the second one, and the next one, and the next one. And then my grandparents' street. There wasn't a single tree on any of those streets. They had all been cut down. And my parents told me that was the only way to stop the spread of the disease, because that beautiful archway of the branches of the trees between one side of the street and the other created a wonderful highway for the beetles. And the trees were planted such that on the same side of the street, branches touched each other. And that created a wonderful way for those beetles to get from one tree to the next on the same side of the street and on the opposite street. And then because they were beetles, sometimes they would fall off and land on a parked vehicle or a passing one and get a ride to another street, and maybe blow off or fall off, and oh, there was new trees on this next street or the next block, and they hitched a ride and spread throughout every part of the city where those trees were planted. And those trees had been planted on many miles of residential streets in that city. And all of those trees, all of them, had to be removed in order to stop the spread of that beetle and of the disease that it carried. So you see, the disease got in because it was a beetle. The beetle would go in under the bark of the tree, and this disease, it was a bacteria or virus or parasite, I'm not sure exactly which, or fungus or some sort, it would get off of the backs of the beetles and start to infect the channels in the trees that carried the nutrients from the soil up into the tops of the trees, and the tree would eventually die. It was such a blow to me to see the loss of all of those trees. But it taught me a lesson about diversity and what happens when we don't have that. I live in an area where there is a wooded area, very much outside the window that's in front of me and in the surrounding communities. And it's beautiful. And part of the beauty of this wooded area is the diversity of trees. And I have learned since that trees have different structures. Some trees have a canopy or a root system that spreads as wide as the canopy, as the tree, the branches of the tree. And it may be quite shallow, and it spreads all throughout the ground in that area. And it provides almost kind of like a mat or a great big footprint for that tree. And there are other trees that have more of a tap root. And that root, the central part of that root, can go as deep as the tree grows tall. And it provides a solid anchor deep into the soil, like that. And by having this diversity of trees, some with a taproot, some with a spreading root that spreads out, they help to hold each other up. And so when there are storms that come through, because of the different kinds of root systems and the different kinds of canopies, they are stronger in the face of a storm. There's greater strength in that diversity. If they were all the same, and there are places in the area where I live where there are tree farms, and it's a particular kind of pine tree in this area that is grown on these tree farms, and those pine trees all have the same root system, and they are more vulnerable, number one, to disease. And there has been a disease that got into some of those pine trees a number of years ago. And to get rid of that disease, trees in a big circle around the diseased tree or trees had to be cut down in order to stop the spread of the disease. And those trees, because they are all the same sort of root system, are more vulnerable when storms come through. So there's a vulnerability to storms, the problems that can come, and to the diseases that can come and can wipe out a whole tree farm. And that takes like 20 years to grow again if that wipes out that whole crop of trees. So that's, something to be considered, and really a problem with that. But when there's a diverse woodlot, like in a natural forest, there is that diversity. And even here there are oak trees, but there's multiple kinds of oak trees. Some have great big leaves, some have very tiny, thin, narrow leaves. They look very different from each other. Some grow where it's very moist, called a water oak, and some grow in higher ground where there is less moisture. And then there are other trees, other varieties of trees, from ones that lose their leaves to pine trees and cedar trees and all kinds of trees. And it's a beautiful woodlot because of that. And it's stronger and more durable because of that. A lone tree in somebody's yard is much more vulnerable to a storm that comes through than trees in a woodlot. So I've learned about the power of diversity. And as I think about it, this is what God put into creation. That diversity of trees also means that there is a diverse kind of food and cover for all kinds of creatures, for birds. Some like to nest in the pine trees, some like to nest higher up in trees, some like to nest closer down in trees that don't grow as tall. It's all the diversity of habitats. Those different kinds of oak trees produce different sizes and kinds of acorns, and they are eaten by different animals. And the pine seeds and pine trees, the pine seeds attract different kinds of birds. And there is another kind of tree that has a seed pod that's kind of like a ball and with spiny things around the outside of it. And there are certain kinds of birds that can get into that to eat the seeds out of that seed pod. And so all of these different kinds of seeds, different kinds of acorns, different kinds of habitat are there by God's creation for different animals, different birds, the deer, the raccoons, the possum, fox. I've seen even occasionally a coyote around here, and rabbits and squirrels and all kinds of creatures. And that's part of the beauty of the diversity. It's there to help all kinds of things flourish, not just one. Yes, there is beauty in mass plantings. There are times where in one of my gardens, I've had a massive bloom of a certain yellow uh, colored flower called a brown-eyed Susan. And it's beautiful in that massive planting. And it produces a lot of seeds, which some of the birds love. But it's also much more susceptible to diseases. And I understand that. Or if the weather isn't quite right, it requires a certain amount of moisture. And if we get a dry spell, those plants look pretty sad. But others are hardier and can withstand dry weather better than the brown-eyed Susan can. So every plant has its place and its purpose. And the mass plantings, yes, they have a beauty to them. Yes, they have a place at times. But to recognize there is a vulnerability there, a vulnerability to diseases, to all kinds of problems and issues and storms that come through, whether it be a physical storm, like a windstorm, blowing off of a hurricane, which can come through this area, a tornado, an ice storm, whatever it might be. Those, when it's all the same sort of tree or planting, it's much more vulnerable. When there's the diversity, it's stronger. It meshes together and forms a greater foundation, a greater resilience in the face of all kinds of adversity. So the next video is going to help reflect a little bit about what does all of this mean for us, for our communities, teams, congregations, whatever it may be. But this is the foundational story, the parable of the trees, and some of the things I learned about the power and the place of diversity and the beauty of God's diverse creation in the midst of all of that. So see you in the next video.